Dear listeners, grief is one of those things that we all experience and almost none of us are taught to carry. We are told to be strong, to give it time, to move on, and so most of us do, or at least we look like that we're doing. We pack it away somewhere, we keep going, and we assume that's what healing looks like. But what if it is not? What if the grief we thought we left behind is still running things quietly, invisibly, in the way that we love and shut down and make decisions and fall apart in the ways that we cannot quite explain? Good to think about, right? So today's conversation is all about that, about what happens when grief doesn't go anywhere. It just goes underground. So, hey, dear listeners, welcome back to another powerful episode of Healthy Mind, Healthy Life, the podcast where we talk honestly about things that shape how we feel, how we function, and how we find our way through. I'm your host, Avik, and I'm really glad that all of you are here today. And, dear listeners, like my guest today, please welcome. But before I take the name, I would love to tell you about him. My guest today walks in the space of grief, not the surface level kind, but the kind that lives in the body long after we think we have dealt with it. And he's here to talk about what unprocessed grief actually does to our mental health, what honest grieving really looks like, and how the habits that we form around loss as teenagers can quietly shape everything that comes after. So, please welcome our guest, Robert DelFave. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Avik. Really glad to be here.
Amazing, amazing. So, Robert, before we get into the details today, I want to come with one of my curiosity is like, what brought you to this work personally? Like, grief is not an easy space to choose to spend your professional life in. So, what pulled you toward it rather than just go away from it?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I lost my dad when I was 14, and I lost my mom when I was 26. And for a long time, I really just kind of carried it the way that most people do, kind of like what you were saying earlier. They hold their grief very quietly, and they're doing all this while they're keeping busy, and they're just trying to look fine on the outside. And I think for myself, I eventually just kind of learned that grief doesn't really go away when you ignore it. It will wait for you. And
Mm,
that realization became the foundation of everything that I'm building right now. So I'm a grief coach, and I also host a podcast called Unparented. And
mhm,
I'm also finishing a book for grieving teenagers.
mm,
And so that's kind of like really what led me into this was just, I spent 20 plus years of my life carrying the grief quietly. And, something kind of clicked in me where I was like, you know what? I'm tired of running from my grief. I really want to face my grief, but I want to do it in a non-clinical way.
mm.
And that's really where it got to me where I am today.
So, okay. So I definitely also love to bring the misconception part. Like you named something in the way that you framed, today's conversation that I think it's very, very important. And you said that unprocessed grief is something most people don't see coming. And I think that's true because most of us have very narrow idea of what grief is, and we associate with it with the death, with funerals, with a defined period of sadness. So what is the misconception here that keeps people from kind of recognizing their own unprocessed grief for what it actually is?
Yeah. So, I mean, when you really look at it, unprocessed grief rarely looks like sadness, right? So I think when we think of grief, we think it's just people crying, I mean, which it can, of course, 100%, but I think it rarely looks like sadness. And I think that's the thing, right? Is that
Mm.
unprocessed grief can show up as anxiety. It can show up as numbness. It can even be like having a short fuse, right? Like just you fly off the handle, right? It can also be difficult being present in relationships, right? And so I think a general feeling that something is off, but you can't quite name it, that's to me what unprocessed grief looks like. And so I've talked to people who had no idea that their irritability or their disconnection, their inability to even feel joy, that all of that was really rooted in a loss that they've never fully sat with. So to me, that's really what unprocessed grief looks like. And to give you a good example, right? And I had mentioned this earlier, right? I lost my dad at 14, and
Yeah.
for years, I functioned totally fine on the outside, right? I
Mm.
went to school, I had a job, I had relationships, but I never really learned to carry grief quietly, or I had to learn to carry grief quietly, right? Because nobody around me knew what to do with it either. And that's a thing, especially for those that might, I mean, I'm not sure if your listeners are 14, 15, or 16, but even for adults, right? It's like even as
Yeah.
adults, we don't really know how to deal or how to help somebody who's grieving. So like, the silence became a pattern, and patterns like that don't just kind of stay in one corner of your life. They kind of tend to spread. And so they kind of go into different aspects of your life, your friendships, your job, your mental health, right?
Correct. Exactly. What does that grief look like when it surfaces in ways that people don't connect to loss? The anxiety, the numbness, the reactions that seem disappropriate to and what's happening in that moment.
So I think that's a good question, right? Maybe the way I can flip this is maybe like what does like healthy grief look like? Like how does it
Yeah.
what does it look like to grieve healthy, right? And so I want to be totally clear with your listeners, right? Is that healthy grieving doesn't mean grieving faster or cleaner or better. It just means grieving honestly. It means like stopping the performance that we put on, like of like it's okay. Like people put on a performance of like I'm okay, but you're
Mm.
but you're actually really not, right? And so I think healthy grieving means finding at least one person or a space where you're allowed to say what's actually true. And I think for me it was just being able to say to people, I'm not okay. I'm not okay. I've been carrying around the death of my parents for decades. I'm not okay. It means like moving toward the grief instead of running around it or running away from it. And that's really something that I've been doing, right? The podcast was really the start of that. I remember telling my wife, I just I did, talk therapy. I did the clinical talk therapy, and it was great, and it has its own place for it. But
Mm.
what it can't do for you is it doesn't really help you moving forward. So when you sit and you do therapy, you're kind of like healing yourself from the past, but it's not really helping you in the present or the future. And so what I did one day is I remember just going downstairs talking to my wife, and I said, I think I want to start a podcast and talk about my dead parents. And she thought, that's a great idea. And then I went upstairs and I started putting together this idea. And then I came back downstairs and I said, I think I'm gonna try to find other people who've also lost their parents and maybe talk to them about their parents and their parents dying? And so it's really about how can we take the grief and run towards it versus running away from it. So that to me is really what like healthy grieving looks like.
That's interesting. That's interesting. I mean, obviously, like, so it's not always a feeling of sadness. Sometimes it shows up in anger or kind of, let's say, flatness or a kind of low grade restlessness that someone has just learned to live with. I mean, that's such an important thing to name. So, uh, I mean, if you have also think like and the root cause or the deeper patterns, you specifically mentioned that grief habits we form as teenagers, and that framing really caught my attention because adolescence is already such a kind of re-establishing time emotionally. And when loss arrives, then whether it's the death of someone close, the end of a family as it was, a friendship or sense of safety, uh, what does a teenager typically do with the grief? Like, why do those early responses tend to become patterns that follow us for the decades?
Yeah. So I think the way that I think about it is teenagers need more than anything, teenagers need permission. Because you have to think, like, we were all teenagers at one point, right? And so, I mean, I grew up in the, was born in the 90s, so I grew up, in the early 2000s as a teenager. But like, you have like teenagers are very angsty, like they're very temperamental. But what I've learned is that teenagers, more than anything, is that they need permission, and they need permission to feel exactly what they actually feel, not the version of grief that looks appropriate or acceptable. And I think that that's the thing, is teens are incredibly perceptive, right? They know when adults are uncomfortable. And when nobody names the thing, they learn that the thing can't be named. And so I think that that's quite I just think it's just very interesting
Mm,
for when you think of teenagers and how they grieve. A lot of teenagers will just sit and be quiet, right? Because they don't even know what they're feeling. So it's very difficult to what I've learned, and again, from experience, is you can take a child or a teenager to a therapist, but they don't even really know what they're feeling. And when you meet a teenager who has no idea what they're really feeling or how to name it, and you bring them
mm,
somewhere that only wants to work with them in a clinical method, a clinical way, they end up
mm.
they end up closing themselves off. And then they bury it,
Yeah.
that's what I'm really learning when it comes to grief in teenagers specifically.
Mm, exactly. I got it. Yeah. And as adults carrying those patterns, maybe someone who learned as a teenager and disappear into work, or maybe make themselves useful to everything else rather than feel, how do those habits compound over time?
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Are you ready to unlock your full potential? I want to introduce you to the Fit, Healthy, and Happy podcast, a powerful resource to transform your life today. With expert interviews, practical tips, and inspiring stories, this podcast is your roadmap to lasting wellness. Here's what a listener has to say.
I used to struggle with my health, but this podcast changed everything. It's like having a personal trainer, nutritionist, and life coach totally for free.
With over 2,000 five-star reviews, we're a podcast you can trust. The Fit, Healthy, and Happy podcast, available now wherever you get your podcasts.
Well, what do you mean by compound over time? Like, what do you mean by that?
I mean, so suppose like a teenager who got into this pattern, who understood, and then time when time moves on, he or she also, with the work and everything else in the life, it started to, I mean, used to that. So, I mean, how do these habits tends to come up over the time?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the way that I like to think about it is grief will affect our mental health long
Mm,
term significantly. And I think that maybe this is what you're trying to get to, Avik, is how does this really, what does this look like long term? And I think in certain ways, right, people rarely connect back to the original loss or whatever the original thing is, right? But I
yeah,
like to think that long term, it can look like chronic anxiety,
yeah,
depression. It can affect your relationship. You now have relationship struggles, emotional numbness, not being able to feel any emotion. And I can tell you that all of those things has happened to me, where even like significant things in my life. When we had our
mm,
first daughter, my oldest will be
mm,
5 years, so almost 5 years ago, right? I
mm,
remember we're at the hospital. My daughter, was born, and like I don't really remember feeling like this overwhelming sense
mm,
of happiness. Now, of course, I was extremely happy that my daughter was born, but what I remember feeling was like anxiety, like struggle, that emotional numbness, right? And I think when teenagers are not able to deal with their grief as teenagers, there's a lot of downstream effects that end up like moving along with them, right? There's these downstream effects of grief that was never processed. And so the mind will find ways to cope, Believe me, we all have coping mechanisms, right? But coping is not the same way as healing. And over time, long term, the weight of carrying something completely unaddressed really will take a toll. I've talked to people in their 40s and their 50s who are still running from loss that happened decades ago. The body keeps score is something that they say. And I think grief is absolutely no different. Grief 100% keeps score.
Exactly. Exactly. So, so there's something really, really compassionate in understanding that. And the teenager who shut down was not being avoidant. They were surviving with the tools they had. The problem is those tools don't always retire when the emergency does. And that's, I think that's not a character flaw. And that's just how humans work. So, yeah. And if we talk about like how it shows up in the real life, like let's make this kind of real moment. Let's think of it. Like, suppose someone is listening right now and they haven't lost anyone recently. Touch wood. Nothing bad goes on for anyone. But still, just for the discussion, like nothing dramatic has happened. So life looks fine on the surface, but something feels off. There's a weight that they cannot name it, a numbness that they have almost gotten used to, a way of being slightly disconnected from the things that used to matter. So is that the grief or and if it is, then how would they know?
Yeah, I think everybody has to take an internal. They have to really think and maybe do like an internal MRI or an internal body scan, right? A mental body scan. And I think they really, if something has never really, if they never really experienced this, any kind of traumatic loss in their life, but something feels off for them, I think they really need to take a look inside and think, what could it possibly be? Because something is 100% affecting them. Now, I don't know. I personally would not say that that's grief per se. But what I will say though is anything that has affected them, that has changed them, if you've been changed from, if you have been changed, you feel that you've been changed from something, it doesn't matter what it is. You can grieve that 100%. You can 100% grieve a previous version of yourself. So maybe they haven't experienced a traumatic loss. Maybe it's something, it could have just been, it could have been anything, like maybe like they lost their job, like that's not like a loss or a death, right? But if it's changed you, or if it's affected a previous version of you, that's grief, right? We should name that. That is 100% grief.
Correct. Okay. And the people around someone who is carrying unprocessed grief, maybe children, partners, close friends, or anyone. What are they experiencing that the grieving person often cannot see it from inside?
So the question, what is somebody see who's with the grieving person? Is that the question?
Like someone who is carrying actually those grief, what they experience, what the grief, how do I process? Like, suppose that grieving person is with someone like their friends, family, or someone close. So what they are experiencing that the grieving person often cannot see it from inside.
What does the person with the griever experience?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good question, Avika. I don't really know, to be honest. I could put myself in my situation. I've had I have friends who a couple of years ago, like they lost a child. and me and my wife, we grieved alongside with them. And now again, like it didn't affect me in the same way. Like I didn't lose that child, but because I love my friends, right? We love our friends. We're very close with our friends. We walked through them with that grief. So, I remember, hearing the story and crying with them. And I think even now, there's plenty of times where maybe we think of him, their child, we think of that child and I'll start crying, right? Because I feel so close. When you're so close to somebody, doesn't matter. They could be family, they could not be family, right? But if you're that close with somebody and they let you in on the grief, right? They're asking you to walk with them, or you just decide, hey, I want to just walk with you with that grief. You will feel what they're feeling. It's not the same, right? Because you didn't lose that child, but you are affected by that grief from the ones that you love. If that makes any sense.
If I also say, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, like the person who is most affected by their own process grief is often the last to recognize. And the people who love them are living with the impact, like without always having the language for what's happening. I mean, is it right? Right.
I think you're definitely onto something. I mean, the way that I think it's like secondary loss, like it, if my friends lost their child, right? But we're so close with them, like that's secondary loss for us, right? We're not the primary, we're not the primary grievers, but we process it as well because, I mean, it is also very sad. Like it's also very sad, right? If your best friends lose a child, like it's a very sad thing. So we're also feeling that, but also we're walking alongside them with their grief.
Got it. Got it. Yeah. And also, if I have to say that grief is not linear. Most people know that intellectually, but there's a particular kind of discouragement that comes when you think you have moved through something and then, you know, a smell, a date on calendar brings it all flooding back. So, and how do you help someone understand that that's not regression? That it doesn't mean the work they have done, it didn't count.
Right. No, 100%. So we like to call those grief ambushes, right? And those are totally normal. It doesn't matter whether you're 5 days or 5 months out from the loss or you're 5 years out from that loss. All it takes is one smell or one song or one memory, right? For all of that grief to rush back. That's called grief ambush. That's what I like to call them, grief ambushes. I mean, you could be in the Target parking lot, you're just about to walk into Target.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden you just have a quick memory that pops in your mind and boom, there you go. Grief will overtake you. It will flood in. And that is not like what you're saying. That does not mean that you're not processing your grief correctly or you're doing anything wrong, right? Those things are totally normal and that's okay. Again, it does not matter how far away you have been from that grief. Again, I'm 21 years out from losing my dad. And I'm in the middle of writing a book right now for grieving teenagers and, writing about stories about me and my dad that I remember. And just reading them back, I just start crying. My wife, she comes running over. She's like, "Oh my gosh, are you okay? What's wrong?" And I'm like, "No, it's okay." Like they're not like these sad grieving tears. I'm grieving it, but I'm also kind of happy in the same side, right? Because I remembered that story or that memory, and I'm like, oh, like I'm very sad because I miss my dad, but I'm also like I've also processed it, and I'm glad I remembered that memory, right? I can relive that memory. So yeah, I mean it's twofold. It does not mean that you're backpedaling or you're moving backwards in grief, right? It's totally normal to have a grief ambush.
Got it. Got it. And also, like, what is it? Like, for the listeners, like, if you have to say, let's suppose for anyone who is listening who recognizes something in today's conversation in themselves or in someone they love, where can they find you and what's the best way to take a step in your world?
Yeah. So the best place for anybody is to start at robertdelfave.com. So everything that I have lives there. My coaching offerings live there. My podcast is on there. I also offer a 5-day. It's a free 5-day audio series. It's called Not Alone. So it's really for anybody who isn't ready to talk to somebody yet, but wants somewhere quiet to begin. Right? It's just one short audio a day that's delivered straight to your inbox. There's no pressure. There's no pitch. Right? It's just a place to start for people. And then I'm also on Threads. You can find me there too under Robert DelFave.
Amazing, amazing. And Robert, like, if I have to give one advice to all the listeners today, what that will be?
Yeah, yeah. So I have three things, right? The first is to name it out loud. Even if it's just to yourself, right? You could just say, I'm still grieving this. That's one, right? Grief that's named has less power over you than grief that's hidden. So I want people to remember that. The second thing is find one safe person, not someone who will fix it or rush you through it, just someone who can sit with you and they can do it without flinching, right? That one person can change everything. And then the third thing is stop measuring your grief against a timeline. So there is no correct amount of time to grieve someone or something that you loved. The question isn't, should I still feel this? The question is, am I carrying this in a way that actually works for me? So that's the advice I would leave for the listeners.
Amazing, amazing. So, dear listeners, what I'll do is I'll put all the links and the details into the show notes for a easy reference. And I have to share with you, dear listeners, that if I could carry one thing from this conversation, it would be grief that goes unnamed. It doesn't disappear. It just finds other ways to speak. And the most courageous thing that you can do is finally learn to listen. And yes, that's the wrap for today's episode of Healthy Mind, Healthy Life. And if this conversation brought something up for you, even just a quiet recognition, please don't rush past it. That recognition is the beginning of something, I would say. And Robert's details, as I mentioned, it will be there in the show notes. And if someone in your life is carrying a grief that they have never had space to name, then this episode might be the thing that you share with them. With this hope, this is your host, Avik, and this is Healthy Mind, Healthy Life. Take good care of yourself today and of the parts of yourself that have been waiting a long time for some gentleness. So, see you next time. Thank you so much.